In the name of God, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Amen. Well, during the week I was interviewed by the Chasers' Julian Morrow for a program called The Year That Made Me. This program went to air this morning at 9:15, so hardly any of you heard it because you're on your way to church. There we go, Father Todd heard it. But you can, of course, catch this on Radio National's Listen app, and I encourage you to do so. As I prepared for this interview, I quickly became aware that the year that made me, or perhaps the years that made me, were mostly times of profound difficulty and hardship. The year that made me was a desert experience, a time in the wilderness. The years that make us, that change us, that help us to find who we really are most often years in the desert. If you, of course, want to know which year was the year that made me, you'll have to listen to the program, because I'm not really going to talk about that this morning. I was also asked to choose a song that somehow or other spoke of that year in my life. I chose Simon and Garfunkel's 1964 hit, The Sound of Silence. Because what you notice most in the wilderness, what you notice most in the desert, what you notice most in both the physical and metaphorical wilderness is the profound silence. As I reflect on Mark's version that we heard this morning of Jesus' time in the wilderness, three details of that story stand out for me, and perhaps they will for you as well. Firstly, the story tells us that Jesus didn't choose to go into the wilderness. We are told that the Spirit of God actually drove him, compelled him, forced him into the desolation of a wild and unsafe place. Now, I find that detail actually rather comforting because it rings true to me. Most of the time, we don't choose to enter the wilderness. We don't volunteer for pain. We don't sign up for loss or danger or terror. The wilderness happens to us. And whether it comes to us in the guise of a devastating pandemic, a frightening hospital stay, a breakdown in health and security, a broken relationship, a hurting child, a loss of faith, the wilderness appears, unbidden and unwelcome at our doorsteps. And sometimes, it is God's own Spirit that drives us there, although we are rarely ever aware of that at the time. The year that made me drove me into the wilderness. It drove me to the edge of the church. It drove me to the edge of sanity. But it was in that wilderness that I found out who I really was. So does this mean that God wills bad things to happen to us just to teach us lessons? Of course not. Does it mean that God is there in the wilderness with us, ready to teach and shape and redeem us, even in the most barren places and periods of our lives? Yes, it does mean that. In the startling economy of God, even a dangerous desert becomes holy ground. Even our wilderness wanderings can reveal the presence of God, the presence of the divine in our midst. And this is not because God takes pleasure in our pain, but because we live in chaotic, fragile, and a broken world that includes deserts. And because God's way of being is to take the things of shadow and death and wring from them resurrection. Secondly, our wilderness journeys sometimes last a long time. The year that made me lasted almost 2 years. Now, I've never spent 40 days in solitude and silence, much less in a state of physical deprivation and danger. Although I will spend 30 days in silence later this year. But I can't imagine that Jesus' time in the wilderness passed quickly. The sense I get from Mark's story is that Jesus despaired at the grim place filled with wild beasts, that he experienced each day as a battle of mind, body and spirit. Perhaps the hours stretched into years and the nights felt endless. Maybe the landscape itself mocked his weary senses, its unvarying bleakness breaking his heart. For those of us who live in impatient, quick-fix cultures, this aspect of the wilderness is daunting because we tire so easily, we despair so quickly. Why, we ask, is this pain not ending? Why are our prayers going unanswered? Where is God? But maybe we need to ask a harder question. Why did Jesus need the wilderness? What is it about us that needs the wilderness, the desert? Mark's story begins with an account of Jesus' baptism. When Jesus rose up out of the waters of the Jordan River, the heavens are torn open and God announces Jesus' identity loud and clear. You are my Son, the beloved. With you I am well pleased. But what happened to that certainty, that sense of identity and belonging as Jesus' wilderness wandering stretched into week 2 and week 3 and week 4? Did his sense of being the beloved child of God waver? Did the Son of God have to keep reminding himself who he actually was? Did he have hours or even days or weeks when he forgot that truth? At his baptism, Jesus heard the absolute truth about his identity. But that was the easy part. The much harder part comes in the desert, when he had to face down every vicious mocking and assault on that truth. In other versions of this story, the tempter comes to him and says, if you are, the temptation is to doubt who he really is. If you are the Son of God, jump off this cliff, demand that these stones become bread. If you are, it's the temptation of doubting who we are. As the memory of God's voice faded, and the isolation of the wilderness played tricks on Jesus' heart and mind and body, he had to learn, just as we do, he had to learn that his belovedness would still hold. that God's deep and unconditional delight would never depend on external circumstances. If those 40 days in the wilderness was a time of self-creation, a time for Jesus to decide who he was and how he would live out that calling, that identity, then here is what he chose. Deprivation over power. Vulnerability over rescue. Obscurity over honour. At every instance in which he could have reached for the certain, the extraordinary, the miraculous, he reached instead for the precarious, the quiet, silent, the ordinary. Of course, there is nothing easy about affirming Jesus' choices. Indeed, in fact, sometimes I find his choices appalling. How often I would prefer to reach for the miraculous, the certain, the intervention, the dramatic rescue, the long-awaited vindication. How often I find myself echoing the demands of the tempter. Feed me, deliver me, prove yourself to me. How often I find the restraint of God offensive. That's why sometimes we, like Jesus, need long stints in the wilderness. We need our desert experience. We need our Lenten experience to learn what it really means to be the beloved of God, the child of God, and to learn that no matter what our circumstances are, that truth can never change. Because the truth is that we can be loved and uncomfortable at the same time. We can be loved and vulnerable at the same time. In the wilderness, the love that survives is flinty and hard, not soft and fleeting. It is salvific, it's saving, not sentimental. And learning to trust it takes time. It takes a very long time. Thirdly, there were angels in that wilderness. And even in the land of shadows and starvation, even in the place where the wild beasts roamed, God's agents of love and care lingered in the silence and in the discomfort and in the pain. This too is a startling and comforting truth. It's a truth that we can recognise if we open our eyes and take a good look around. Even in the grimmest places, God abides. And somehow, without reason or explanation, comfort comes, help comes, rest comes, solace comes. Granted, our angels don't always appear in the form that we prefer, but they come. In the year that made me, I met every Tuesday morning for an hour with a small group of people where we sought to listen to the scriptures, and they listened to me kick and scream and rail at the world and at God. They listened. Each day I went home to a family who was never actually quite sure that I would return, and at times probably wished that I wouldn't. But they loved. All these were my angels in the desert. I wonder what Jesus' angels looked like. Did they manifest as winged creatures from heaven? Or perhaps, more likely, as a comforting breeze across the scorched hills, as a trickle of water on a parched tongue, as a swirl of consolations on a clear and cloudless night. What do your angels look like? Do you recognise them when they show up, when they minister to you, hold you, brace you? Do you hear a new version of God's voice calling, "You are beloved"? If you recognise them, then what would it be like for you to become one? To enter into someone else's barren place and become a messenger of God in their desert. As we begin our journey into Lent, may we experience the companionship of Christ, whose vulnerability becomes our strength, whose hunger becomes our food, whose thirst becomes our water. May we enter with courage the desert we can't choose to avoid. May our long stints amongst the wild beasts teach us who we really are, the precious and beautiful and beloved children of God. And when the angels, in all their sweet and secret guises, whisper the name beloved into our ears, may we listen and believe them. May we all have a holy Lent. The Lord be with you.